I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only lie there in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, my body frozen like a corpse, while my mind screamed for help. The tea my sister Lena had brought me, the first kind gesture she'd offered in years, had turned my muscles to stone. My fingers wouldn't twitch. My lungs barely pulled air, but my ears worked perfectly. That's how I heard her footsteps pause at my door. That's how I heard her whisper to someone in the hallway, "Just make it look natural." The door creaked open. Heavy footsteps crossed the threshold. A man's silhouette blocked the faint light from the hall. He knelt beside my bed, pressed 2 fingers to my throat, and muttered something that made my blood run cold. But here's what I didn't understand, what kept me from surrendering to the darkness pulling at the edges of my consciousness. He didn't kill me. He checked if I was alive. And when he stood up, his voice was shaking. Who was this man, and why did my sister need my death to look natural? My name is April Martinez. I'm 36 years old, and I work as a senior data analyst for a consulting firm in Virginia. I've built a good life for myself, stable career, my own apartment, a retirement account that grows a little more each year. None of my family knows any of this. I learned a long time ago that sharing my accomplishments only invited silence or worse comparisons to my younger sister. Let me take you back to the week before that terrible night. I was sitting at my desk in Virginia when a letter arrived from the IRS. It claimed I had failed to report $85,000 in income from the previous year. $85,000 I had never seen, never earned, never knew existed. I assumed it was an error, maybe identity theft, maybe a clerical mistake. I planned to deal with it after I returned from Pennsylvania. My mother had just had knee surgery, and someone needed to help her recover. My father certainly wasn't going to do it, and my sister Lena, well, Lena, had never lifted a finger for anyone but herself in 32 years. So I requested 2 weeks off work and drove 5 hours to my childhood home. I mentioned the IRS letter to my mother during a phone call before I left, just casually the way you mention an annoying errand you need to run. I didn't notice the way her voice went tight. I didn't hear the pause before she changed the subject. I was too busy packing my suitcase and arranging for a neighbor to water my plants. I should have paid attention. Growing up in that house, I was always the afterthought. My father Richard made no secret of his preference for Lena. She was charming, where I was quiet. She was bold, where I was careful. "Lena takes after me," he would say at dinner. His chest puffed with pride. Then his eyes would slide to me, and his voice would flatten. "April. I don't know who she takes after." My mother never defended me. Gloria would sit there with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on her plate, holding something behind her expression that I could never quite name. Guilt, maybe, or fear. I spent years trying to earn the warmth she gave so freely to Lena. I never succeeded. The only person who ever saw me clearly was my grandmother, Eleanor. She died 15 years ago, but before she passed, she gave me a small tin box with a strange instruction. "Don't open this in front of your father. When you're truly on your own, you'll understand." I kept that box in my apartment in Virginia. I never opened it. I thought it was just a sentimental keepsake, not a warning I should have heeded. When I arrived at my parents' house, I expected the usual dynamic. I was right. I cooked, I cleaned. I helped my mother to the bathroom and changed her bandages and managed her medication schedule. Lena showed up twice in 4 days, both times, with her phone out, snapping photos for Instagram. "Taking care of Mama," her caption read, complete with a heart emoji. She stayed for 20 minutes each visit before claiming she had somewhere else to be. I said nothing. I had learned long ago that protesting only made me look petty. On the 5th evening, something changed. Lena came into my room with a cup of herbal tea. "You've been working so hard," she said, her voice unusually soft. "I made this for you, chamomile, to help you sleep." I should have questioned it. Lena had never done anything kind for me without an audience to witness it, but I was exhausted, bone-tired from caregiving and years of being invisible. I took the cup. I drank it. 30 minutes later, my body stopped obeying me. My legs went first, then my arms, then my fingers. I collapsed onto my bed, my mind screaming inside a body that had become a prison. Through the crack in my door, I saw Lena's silhouette. I heard her whisper to someone I couldn't see, "Just do what Dad asked." The door creaked open wider, and heavy footsteps crossed the threshold into my room. I could not turn my head. I could not close my eyes. All I could do was lie there staring at the ceiling while a stranger approached my bed. He knelt beside me. I felt 2 fingers press against my throat, checking my pulse. His touch was clinical professional, like someone trained to assess vital signs. He leaned closer and I could hear his breathing shallow and uneven, as if he was nervous. "She's still breathing." He muttered more to himself than to anyone else. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. The dosage was too strong. His words sent ice through my veins. Dosage. They had drugged me deliberately, and something had gone wrong. I was supposed to be unconscious, maybe worse, but instead I was trapped in this horrible in-between state, aware of everything, but unable to respond to any of it. I focused on what I could observe. His voice was deep, but unsteady. His hands trembled as he checked my breathing. This was not the behavior of a killer. This was a man caught in something he did not fully understand, and he was scared. He stood up and stepped back from my bed. Through my peripheral vision, I could see his silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a dark jacket. He ran his fingers through his hair and exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with worry. Lena appeared in the doorway. Her voice was sharp and patient. "Is she out?" "She's breathing," the man said. "But barely. Lena, I didn't sign up for this. You said she just needed to sleep. You didn't say anything about, keep your voice down." Lena stepped into the room, and I heard her heels click against the hardwood floor. She stopped somewhere near the foot of my bed. "Dad said she's been stealing from them for years. Thousands of dollars. Did you know that my own sister taking money from our parents while pretending to be the responsible one?" The accusation was so absurd that I would have laughed if my body had allowed it. I had never taken a single dollar from my parents. I had been financially independent since I was 23 years old. I paid for my own apartment, my own car, my own life. The idea that I was stealing from them was insane, but the man did not know that. He only knew what Lena had told him. After Friday, Lena continued, her voice dropping to something cold and determined. "She won't be able to touch their money anymore. The court will make sure of that, and maybe then Dad will finally see the truth. I'm the one who protected this family, not her. I've always been the one who actually cared." Her words revealed something I had suspected but never confirmed. This was not just about money. This was about our father's approval. Lena had spent her entire life basking in his favoritism, and somewhere along the way, she had become terrified of losing it. She would do anything, even this, to prove she was the loyal daughter. The man shifted uncomfortably. "This feels like it's going too far. What if she wakes up? What if she remembers?" "She won't remember anything," Lena said dismissively. "The stuff you gave her causes confusion. By the time she's coherent, it'll be too late. Just do what you were hired to do and stop asking questions." Hired. The word echoed in my paralyzed mind. This man was not a friend of Lena's. He was not a random stranger. Someone had paid him to be here tonight. They left my room. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and I was alone in the darkness. My thoughts drifted, pulled by the drugs still coursing through my system. I found myself remembering my grandmother's funeral 15 years ago. The church had been filled with flowers, white lilies her favorite. Family members I barely recognized had dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs and murmured about what a wonderful woman Eleanor had been. But my father had not cried. I remembered watching him during the service, waiting for some sign of grief, some crack in his stoic expression. Instead, I saw something that troubled me even then, though I was only 21 years old and did not fully understand it. He looked relieved. When the casket closed for the final time, my father's shoulders relaxed. He took a deep breath, like someone who had been holding tension for a long time and could finally let it go. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. People grieve differently, I reasoned. Maybe relief was part of his process. Now, lying paralyzed in my childhood bedroom, I was not so sure. My grandmother's last words to me surfaced through the haze of memory. She had been in the hospital, thin and frail, against the white sheets. She had taken my hand in both of hers and looked at me with an intensity that had startled me. "You're the strongest one in this family, April," she had said. "One day you'll understand why I'm giving this to you and not them." I had assumed she meant the tin box, the one she pressed into my hands before I left that day. The one with the strange instruction to never open it in front of my father. I had kept that box for 15 years without ever looking inside. I thought it was just a keepsake, a sentimental gesture from a dying woman. But my grandmother had looked at my father during that visit. She had watched him hover in the doorway of her hospital room, impatient and distracted, checking his watch every few minutes, and her expression had shifted into something close to contempt. She knew something about him, something she tried to warn me about, and I had been too young, too naive, too desperate to believe in my family's goodness to listen. The hours passed slowly. The paralysis began to fade, starting with my fingers. I could twitch them slightly, then curl them into my palm. Sensation crept back into my arms and legs, like blood returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. It was painful pins and needles spreading across my skin, but I welcomed the discomfort. It meant I was regaining control. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Lena's voice, muffled but recognizable, said something I could not make out. Then silence. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing slow. I needed them to think I was still unconscious. The door opened. Someone approached my bed. Lena, I could tell by the scent of her perfume. She stood there for a long moment watching me. I forced myself to remain perfectly still. "Still out," she murmured, then left. When I was certain she was gone, I opened my eyes. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights through the curtains. I turned my head slowly, testing my recovering muscles, and saw something on the floor beside my bed. A card. Small and white with dark lettering. It took all my strength to reach down and pick it up. The movement was clumsy, my fingers still weak, but I managed to bring it close enough to read. Marcus Webb, private investigator. A private investigator. In my bedroom, in the middle of the night. The jealous sister explanation I had been constructing in my mind suddenly felt incomplete. Lena was many things, petty, selfish, desperate for approval, but she was not sophisticated enough to hire a PI. This was something bigger. Someone else was pulling strings. Just before dawn, I heard a car pull into the driveway. A door slammed. Heavy footsteps crossed the porch and entered the house. My father's voice cut through the morning quiet, sharp and commanding. He was not asking questions. He was giving orders. "Is it done?" "Good. The hearing is Friday. Make sure she stays sedated until then." He paused, and when he spoke again, his tone was cold with certainty. "And remember, she's been unstable for years. Everyone will believe it." My father's words hung in the air like a death sentence. The hearing is Friday. She's been unstable for years. Everyone will believe it. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as his footsteps moved through the house. A door closed somewhere down the hall. Voices murmured too low to make out the words, and then silence. I had 4 days. 4 days before my own father tried to have me declared mentally incompetent. 4 days before I lost the right to control my own life. I waited until the house fell completely quiet. The paralysis had mostly faded, leaving behind a deep exhaustion and a dull ache in my muscles. Moving felt like swimming through thick mud, but I forced myself upright. I found my shoes by the bed and my purse on the dresser where I had left it. My car keys were still inside. The hallway was dark. I crept past my parents' bedroom, past Lena's old room where I could hear her snoring softly, past the bathroom where a nightlight cast a faint glow. The front door seemed impossibly far away. Every floorboard threatened to creak. Every shadow looked like someone waiting to catch me, but no one stirred. I slipped out the front door and into the cold morning air. I drove for 20 minutes before I felt safe enough to stop. A gas station appeared on my right, one of those old places with a payphone still mounted near the restrooms. I pulled in my hands, shaking on the steering wheel. The PI's card was still in my pocket. Marcus Webb. I did not know if I could trust him, but I had no other options. He was the only lead I had. I fed coins into the payphone and dialed the number. It rang 4 times before a groggy voice answered. "Webb?" "This is April Martinez," I said. "You were in my bedroom last night. You checked my pulse. I need to know why." There was a long pause. When Marcus spoke again, all traces of sleepiness had vanished from his voice. "You're coherent. You can talk. How is that possible? The drug wore off." "I heard everything. My sister, my father, all of it. Now tell me what's going on or I'm calling the police." "Don't," he said quickly. "Not yet. Listen to me. I wasn't there to hurt you. I didn't know what your sister was planning. I was hired by your father 3 weeks ago to investigate you. He wanted me to find evidence that you were mentally unstable and financially irresponsible. He said he needed documentation for a court case." My stomach turned. "What kind of court case?" "Guardianship." He's trying to have you declared incompetent so he can take control of your finances and your decisions. But April, here's the thing. I couldn't find any evidence against you. Your credit is excellent. Your employment history is spotless. You have no criminal record, no history of mental illness, nothing. You're one of the most stable people I've ever investigated. I leaned against the payphone, trying to process what he was saying. If you couldn't find anything, why were you at my parents' house? I went there to warn you. I figured something was wrong with the whole situation. Your father was too eager, too insistent. But when I got there, your sister intercepted me. She introduced me to your mother as a friend who knows first aid. She said you had suddenly fallen ill and asked me to check on you. I didn't know about the drugging until I saw you lying there. By then it was too late. I'm sorry. His apology meant nothing to me. What mattered was the information. You said my father hired you. What exactly did he tell you? He said you had been stealing from your parents for years, thousands of dollars from their retirement accounts. He showed me bank statements with your signature on the withdrawal slips. He said you were mentally declining and that he needed to protect the family's assets before you drained them completely. I almost laughed. I've never touched their accounts. I haven't taken a cent from my parents since I moved out at 22. I know, Marcus said, because I did my job properly. I traced those withdrawals. The signatures were forged. The money didn't go to you, it went to accounts controlled by your father. Over $287,000 in 3 years. He's been stealing from his own retirement fund and framing you for it. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. My father had been forging my signature. My father had been draining his own accounts and blaming me. And Lena. My sister, I said slowly. Does she know? I don't think so. Based on what I overheard last night, your father told her you were the thief. She genuinely believes she's protecting your parents by helping him. The sedative she gave you. Your father told her it was a mild sleep aid to help you rest while they sorted out the family finances. She didn't know it would paralyze you. So Lena was a pawn. A willing one, desperate for our father's approval, but a pawn nonetheless. She had drugged me, believing she was doing the right thing. It did not excuse her actions, but it explained them. There's more, Marcus said. You mentioned an IRS letter when I was researching you, something about unreported income. $85,000. Income I never earned. That's the trigger. Your father has been using your identity for over a decade. Tax fraud, credit applications, business loans. He took out a $150,000 mortgage in your name in 2019. The IRS letter was the first crack in his system. If you investigated, you'd find everything. So he filed for guardianship 2 weeks ago as a preemptive strike. 2 weeks ago, I repeated, but I never received any notification. Because he listed your parents' Pennsylvania address as your residence on the petition. The court notice went there. He intercepted it. You were never supposed to know about the hearing until after it happened. Everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. My father had spent years making me invisible, making me seem unstable, making everyone believe I was the lesser daughter. It was not neglect, it was strategy. He needed me to be someone no one would believe. There's something I need to check, I told Marcus. Meet me in Virginia this afternoon. I'll text you the address. I drove to my apartment, my mind racing the entire way. The tin box my grandmother had given me 15 years ago was exactly where I had left it, tucked in the back of my closet behind old photo albums. I carried it to my kitchen table and sat there for a long moment just looking at it. Then I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter and a folded document. The letter was from my grandmother, her familiar handwriting slightly shaky from the illness that was already taking her life. My dear April, it read. Your father filed a false affidavit after I died, claiming I had no will. He stole your inheritance to cover his debts. I couldn't stop him before I passed, but I saved this copy. He made you invisible your whole life so you'd never question anything. But I see you, April. You deserve to be loved. You deserve the truth. The document was her original will. It left her house worth $400,000 specifically to me. Marcus arrived an hour later. I showed him everything. He examined the will carefully, then looked up at me with something like admiration. The original probate fraud was 15 years ago, he said, technically outside the statute of limitations. But here's the thing, your father has been filing false tax returns using proceeds from that stolen inheritance every year since. Each return resets the clock. and that 2019 loan using stolen funds as collateral. That's recent enough to prosecute everything. It all connects. He set down the will and met my eyes. Your father spent 15 years building you into the perfect scapegoat. He made everyone believe you were unstable, so when this moment came, no one would question it. But April, the hearing is Friday. That's 4 days. If you don't prove your competency and expose him before then, you lose everything. Your money, your freedom, your identity, your entire life. He wins. 4 days. That was all I had to save my own life. Marcus and I worked through the night, gathering every document, every record, every piece of evidence we could find. By Thursday evening, I had hired an attorney of my own, a woman named Sandra Chen, who specialized in fraud cases and looked at my father's scheme with the cold fury of someone who had seen this kind of betrayal before. Friday morning, I walked into the courthouse wearing a navy blue suit I had bought for job interviews years ago. My hands were steady, my mind was clear. I had spent 36 years being invisible in my own family. Today they would finally see me. My father was already seated at the petitioner's table when I entered the courtroom. The shock on his face when he saw me was worth every sleepless hour of the past 4 days. He had expected me to still be sedated in Pennsylvania, confused and helpless. He had expected to win by default. Instead, I took my place at the respondent's table with my attorney beside me and met his eyes without flinching. The competency evaluation took less than an hour. I answered every question clearly and correctly. I recited my social security number, my address, my employer, my bank account details. I explained my monthly budget, my retirement contributions, my investment strategy. The evaluator made notes and nodded, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes betraying a hint of confusion about why this case had been filed at all. Then my attorney stood and presented our evidence. She explained that the guardianship petition listed my parents' Pennsylvania address as my residence, not my actual home in Virginia. She showed the court that the notification had been sent to the wrong address deliberately. She used the word fraud 3 times in 5 minutes. The judge's face darkened as she reviewed the documents. She looked at my father with an expression I had never seen anyone direct at him before suspicion. "This petition is dismissed," she announced. "Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into the irregularities in how this petition was filed. Mr. Martinez, I suggest you retain legal counsel. You may need it." My father's face turned gray. For the first time in my life, I watched him lose control of a situation. He opened his mouth to protest, but his attorney placed a hand on his arm and shook his head. They left the courtroom without looking at me. I had won the first battle, but the war was just beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus and I built our case piece by piece. We obtained security footage from my parents' house showing Lena entering my room multiple times, searching through my documents and belongings. We had the forged signatures analyzed by a handwriting expert who confirmed they did not match my actual handwriting, but showed characteristics consistent with my father's hand. We traced every withdrawal from my parents' retirement accounts to investment accounts controlled by my father investments that had failed spectacularly, leaving him desperate for money. The authenticated will from my grandmother proved the probate fraud. The 2019 loan documents proved identity theft. And the recorded phone conversations obtained legally through Marcus's continued investigation captured my father discussing how to manage me and keep me under control. Every piece connected to form a complete picture of 15 years of systematic fraud. My father had stolen my inheritance, destroyed my credit, and tried to steal my freedom, and he had done it all while making me believe I was simply unloved. When we had everything we needed, I made one final visit to my parents' house. I did not warn them I was coming. I found them in the living room with their attorney discussing what they called damage control. Lena was there too, her face pale and drawn. They all looked up when I walked in, and for a moment no one spoke. I placed a thick folder on the coffee table. Transaction records, the authenticated will, loan documents, a digital recorder. "Dad, Lena, I think it's time we talked honestly. Maybe for the first time ever." Their attorney picked up the folder and began flipping through the pages. His face changed as he read first confusion, then alarm, then something close to fear. He stood up abruptly. "I need to excuse myself," he said. Richard, I strongly advise you not to say anything further without new counsel present. He left without looking back. The door closed behind him with a sound like a verdict. My father straightened in his chair, attempting to regain his authority. You've always been unstable, April. This fantasy you've constructed proves it. No one will believe. Then you won't mind if I play these recordings for the police, I said calmly. They're already on their way. I called them 2 hours ago. His bluff collapsed. I watched the calculation in his eyes shift from confidence to desperation to something ugly and cornered. Lena broke first. Her voice cracked as tears spilled down her cheeks. Dad told me you were stealing from them. He showed me the bank statements. He said you never loved this family, that you were just waiting for them to die so you could take everything. I was trying to protect them, April. I was trying to be a good daughter. I looked at my sister, really looked at her and saw her clearly for the first time, not as an enemy, not as the golden child who had stolen my place in our parents' hearts, but as another victim of our father's manipulation, a victim who had chosen not to question, not to verify, not to think for herself, a victim whose desperation for approval had made her a willing accomplice. He used both of us, Lena, I said quietly. The difference is I survived on my own. You needed his approval so badly you'd believe anything he told you, even lies about your own sister. My father turned on Lena with a viciousness I had never witnessed before. You stupid girl. You couldn't even handle a simple task. All you had to do was keep her sedated until the hearing. 3 days. And you couldn't even manage that. His mask fell completely. This was who he really was, not a loving father, not a family patriarch, but a desperate man who saw his own children as tools to be used and discarded. A sound from the hallway made us all turn. My mother emerged from the shadows, trembling, her face wet with tears. I knew April, she whispered. I knew everything. For years. Your father threatened me. He said he'd leave me with nothing if I ever told you about the will. I was terrified of being alone. So I hid your grandmother's letter in that tin box, hoping someday you'd find it on your own. I wouldn't have to be the one to tell you. She covered her face with her hands. I was a coward. I looked at my mother with something beyond anger, a profound, exhausted understanding of who she was and who she had always been. A woman who chose silence over her own daughter, a woman who let me suffer so she could feel safe. Yes, Mom, I said. You were. Police sirens cut through the evening air. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Officers entered the house, and I stepped aside to let them pass. They handcuffed my father first. He protested loudly about family misunderstandings and personal disputes, but the officers ignored him. They had seen the evidence. They knew what he had done. Then they read Lena her rights for her role in the conspiracy. She went quietly, tears streaming down her face, looking back at me with an expression I could not fully read. But my eyes remained fixed on my mother. I watched her realize that 40 years of silence had not protected anyone. It had only ensured that when the destruction finally came, it would be complete. 6 months passed before the legal system delivered its final verdicts. 6 months of depositions and hearings and evidence reviews. 6 months of watching my family's carefully constructed facade crumble piece by piece under the weight of documented truth. My father's sentencing took place on a gray Tuesday morning in federal court. I sat in the gallery dressed simply, my hands folded in my lap. I had no prepared statement. I had no desire to speak. I only wanted to watch. Richard Martinez stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled, his silver hair unkempt for the first time I could remember. Even now, facing the consequences of 15 years of fraud, he refused to accept responsibility. My daughter fabricated all of this. He declared, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone he had used my entire life. She's always been jealous, always been unstable. This family would have been fine without her interference. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for deflection, leaned forward in her chair. Mr. Martinez, the evidence against you is overwhelming and meticulously documented. You spent 15 years systematically exploiting your own daughter while ensuring she had no voice to defend herself. You stole her inheritance. You stole her identity. You attempted to steal her freedom through a fraudulent guardianship petition. The only thing unstable in this courtroom is your moral character. She paused, letting her words settle over the silent courtroom. 12 years in federal prison. No possibility of early parole. I watched them lead my father away in handcuffs. He did not look at me. He had never really looked at me, not once in 36 years. I was merely a tool to him, a convenient target, a name to sign on fraudulent documents. And now I was the reason he would spend the next 12 years behind bars. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet, profound relief that I had finally been believed. After a lifetime of being told I was wrong, I was worthless. I was nothing a courtroom full of strangers had looked at the evidence and seen the truth. Lena's sentencing came 2 weeks later. The charges against her were serious financial fraud conspiracy and administering a controlled substance without consent, but the court acknowledged that she had been manipulated by our father. She received 3 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and mandatory psychological counseling. She found me outside the courthouse after the hearing, her makeup ruined from crying. Her designer clothes wrinkled and unkempt. She looked smaller than I remembered, like someone who had finally stopped performing and discovered she did not know who she really was. I was so desperate for him to love me, she said, her voice breaking. The way he seemed to love the idea of me. I never stopped to ask why he needed me to hate you. I just believed everything he said because believing him was easier than questioning him. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm so sorry, April. I'm so sorry for everything. I looked at my sister for a long moment. I saw the girl who had grown up basking in our father's approval while I stood in the shadows. I saw the woman who had put something in my drink without asking what it would do to me. I saw someone who had made choices, terrible choices, and was only now beginning to understand their weight. I believe you're sorry, Lena. I even believe you didn't fully understand what you were doing, but you chose not to understand. You chose to believe I was a thief without ever asking me directly. You chose to put something in my drink without knowing what it really was. Those were your choices. Being manipulated doesn't erase them. I paused, searching for words that were honest without being cruel. I hope you find out who you are without Dad's approval to chase. I really do. But that's a journey you take alone, not with me. I walked away without embracing her. There was no reconciliation. There was only the truth spoken clearly for the first time between us. With my father imprisoned and all assets frozen for restitution, my mother lost everything. The family home was sold. My father's retirement accounts, his investments, his personal property, all of it went toward repaying what had been stolen from me. The court ordered full restitution of $400,000. After liquidating everything I recovered, $340,000. The remaining $60,000 was placed as a lien against any future assets my father might acquire, including his prison wages. My mother came to me a month after the sentencing, standing on the doorstep of my Virginia apartment with a single suitcase and desperation in her eyes. I have nowhere to go, she said. I know I don't deserve it, but could I stay with you, just until I figure things out? My answer came without hesitation. No, Mom. You chose silence for 36 years. You watched him diminish me, use me, steal from me, and you said nothing. You knew about Grandma's will. You knew what he was doing with my identity. And your solution was to hide a letter in a box and hope I'd magically find it someday. I took a breath, steadying myself. You're 64 years old, and you've never once stood on your own. That's not my fault, and it's not my responsibility to fix. You need to learn who you are without someone else making your decisions. That's your work now, not mine. She moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town. For the first time in over 40 years, she had to manage her own life, pay her own bills, make her own choices exist, without someone else defining her worth. It was not punishment, it was consequence. And perhaps eventually it would become growth. I did not keep the restitution money for myself. Instead, I used it to establish the Eleanor Martinez Foundation, named after the grandmother who had seen me clearly when everyone else looked right through me. The foundation provides legal resources, financial education, and support services for women escaping financial abuse and family exploitation. Its motto is simple: your worth was never theirs to decide. I bought a small cottage by a quiet lake in Virginia. I filled it with plants and books and a kind of silence I had never known before, peaceful silence, not the suffocating kind I grew up with. I began writing my memoir not for revenge, but for the women who might read it someday and recognize their own story in mine. 6 months after everything ended, my mother came to visit. I allowed her inside for 1 cup of tea, but the boundaries between us remained clear and firm. I'm proud of you, she said quietly, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. I should have said that years ago, decades ago. Yes, I agreed. You should have. Her eyes filled with tears. Can you ever forgive me? I considered the question carefully before answering. I don't know yet, Mom. Maybe someday. But I want you to understand something. Forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation. Healing doesn't require forgetting. I can release the anger without inviting you back into my daily life. I can understand your fear without excusing what it cost me. I set down my teacup and met her eyes directly. I am choosing to heal. That's about me, not about you. And right now, healing means building a life where I decide who gets access to it. She nodded, tears falling freely down her cheeks. She did not argue. Perhaps she finally understood. That night, after she left, I stood on my porch and watched the sun set over the lake. I thought about the girl I used to be, invisible, unheard, convinced that her family's blindness meant she had no value. I thought about my grandmother, who saw me when no one else did, who hid the truth in a tin box and trusted me to find it when I was ready. I thought about the night I lay paralyzed in darkness, waiting for the end, only to discover that the door opening wasn't death at all. It was the beginning of everything. I am the strongest one in my family, not because I never fell, but because when I finally understood why I kept falling, I stopped letting them push me down. I see my own worth now, and that is enough. April's story teaches us something every woman needs to remember. Your worth is not determined by how your family treats you. Sometimes the people who should love us the most are the ones who cause the deepest wounds. But their blindness does not make you invisible, it makes them blind. If you recognize yourself in April's journey, if you have ever been made to feel small, dismissed, or used by people who were supposed to protect you, know this: you deserve better. You deserve to be believed. You deserve to take up space. And you have every right to set boundaries even with family, even when it is hard, even when others do not understand. Financial abuse is real. Emotional manipulation is real. And walking away from toxic relationships is not selfish. It is survival. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss another powerful story like this one. And I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand up against your own family to protect yourself? What gave you the strength to fight back? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might give someone else the courage they need today.